Hello everyone, tonight we will pass through heavy iron doors, where time seems to have forgotten to pass. Imagine waking up in a place where the cold of the stones merges with the silence, and where the echoes of the chains tell stories that few have dared to hear. Before we move onto the cold stone floor, perhaps it would be good to remember what kind of prison are we talking about today. Medieval prisons were not, say, hotels for controlled confinement, nor were they carefully planned institutions for the rehabilitation of wandering souls. No, they were improvised, dark, and often forgotten spaces. And by space, I mean a hole in the ground, an abandoned tower, or a windowless room in the basement of a castle. The concept of prison sentence, as we understand it today, didn't really exist. You weren't locked up to serve years with the right to 3 balanced meals. You were imprisoned while awaiting trial, torture, ransom, or oblivion. And of course, what we now call human rights, at the time, would have been considered pure fiction. There were few records, even fewer clear rules, and almost no limits to what could happen inside. Who was arrested? From petty bread thieves to political rivals, indebted merchant, or someone who simply angered the wrong person. Sometimes, an innocent person who didn't know why they were there. And when in doubt, they just let themselves be arrested. After all, the chains were available. Oh, and that idea of a noble guard, concerned for your well-being. Forget it. Many prison guards were hardened ex-soldiers, underpaid, and kept the cells more like body deposits and surveillance centers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy leisurely strolls through forgotten corners of history. By the way, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe I'll light a soft candle, or just have some white noise playing in the background. And come with me. Let's begin tonight's journey together. You wake up, but you don't know if you're awake or still dreaming. Your eyes try to open, but the dense darkness of the cell offers no clear horizon. Only nebulous shapes, shadows that tremble at the slightest movement. The air you breathe is damp, thick, impregnated with ancient mold. Each breath seems to bring with it fragments of wall, of rotting wood, of lives that have passed there. It is a heavy air, saturated with invisible memories. Beneath you, the stone floor is unforgiving. Your back aches. Every muscle seems to scream in protest against the unremitting hardness. There is no mattress, no clean straw, just a thin layer of damp rags, which serve more as a reminder that there was once some care here. You move slowly. The chains creak in response, as if to remind you that you are not alone. The sound of metal fills the silence, a whine of iron that echoes of the walls. And with it comes a chill, the kind of chill that comes not just from the temperature, but from fear that seeps into your bone. Around him, the cell breathes, not in a living way, but like a forgotten organism that has grown accustomed to waiting. Small drops of water run down the stones, forming puddles that vaguely reflect the torches in the corridor. And even these flames seem timid, hesitant to illuminate a world that would rather remain hidden. Time in there is a strange concept. There are no clocks. There is no sun to follow. There is only the alternation between almost total darkness and the fleeting glow of torches when a guard decides to make his rounds. An incomplete cycle that deceives the mind and confuses the body. Waking up, then, is not really a beginning. It is more of a slow return to consciousness, a reappearing in a space that does not change, where every detail seems the same as the day before if there ever was a day before. And in that instant, you understand, there is no rush here. There are no plans. There is only you, and the walls that do not speak. And then, with your body still heavy, and your mind wandering between memories and fears, you feel a new stimulus. It is not an inviting aroma, nor a comforting sound. It is simply the arrival of what they call a meal. A sharp creaking sound from the latch, a quieter creaking sound from the small rusty wooden hatch. Through the gap slides a piece of bread, but perhaps calling it bread would be kind. It is a dried out block, greyish in colour, with a crust so hard that fingers hesitate to touch it. There is no choice. Hunger, cultivated by the endless night, speaks louder. You carefully bring the bread to your mouth. Each bite requires strength, tears a bit of your gums, and leaves your tongue dry with dust. But it is either that or emptiness, and emptiness here is a cunning enemy. Soon after, a rough clay container is pushed through the same crack. The water inside reflects an opaque shine, a cloudy liquid with suspended particles that dance slowly like a small dark universe. Thirst compels you. You bring your lips closer, hesitantly. The first sip already has a metallic taste, strange, with an earthy undertone that reveals the dubious origin of the water. But your throat asks for moisture, and between risks and necessity, you drink, knowing that, in each sip, There may be an invisible danger, with your stomach partially satisfied, but your mind alert. You lie back down again, and you understand that there, eating and drinking are not relief. They are survival tasks permeated by doubt. A constant game between necessity and precaution. There are no flavors. There is no pleasure. There is only function. Each meal reinforces an essential detail of the medieval prison. Even the small gestures of everyday life become trials. And so, another moment drags on, between the bread that does not nourish and the water that does not soothe. The darkness of the cell does not obey the body's natural rhythm. There is no dawn to invite one to wake up, nor sunset to soften the arrival of sleep. And when tiredness weighs on the eyes, that is when a silent dilemma begins. Sleeping would be a welcome relief, but sleeping, with eyes closed, is a risk that few take easily. Because there, in the depths of the cell, darkness is not just the absence of light. It is a stage for invisible presences, for unexpected gestures, for dangers that move in silence. Every sound, even the faintest, is interpreted with redoubled attention. A muffled footstep, a distant creak, a sudden jingle of chains that shouldn't move on their own. And when you try to rest, your mind doesn't shut down. On the contrary, it amplifies everything. Every sigh becomes a warning. Then there are the cellmates themselves, if you can call them that. Not everyone sleeps at the same time. And in the pitch darkness, a hungry, desperate, or creased prisoner can become a palpable threat. A quick glance, a quick hand, and everything changes. Thus, many prefer to rest while awake. A light, interrupted sleep, where the eyes close for a few moments, only to be opened again with a start. It is a rest that never comes completely, a fragile threshold between need and fear. The body pays the price. Fatigue builds up, becoming a weight that numbs the limbs even against one's will. But instinct, sharpened by uncertainty, keeps the spirit alert. Because there, in the medieval cell, closing one's eyes is making room for the unpredictable. And so the cycle repeats itself, night after night, if the concept of night still makes sense. Because in that place, even the simple act of sleeping becomes an invisible battle. And just when you think darkness is your greatest enemy, it reveals other visitors. Silent, persistent, and ever-present. Companions you would never have chosen, but who here show your space without ceremony. The first sign comes with sound, a light brushing, almost imperceptible. Then, a subtle movement in the corner of the vision, small shapes sliding under the boards, between the cracks in the stones. Insects of all shapes, colors that are hard to see in the dark, and that prefer it that way. The walls are quietly alive. Maggots feed on the mold. Ants explore the space. Beetles roam like wandering sentinels. And at night, when the senses are heightened, every little vibration becomes an uncomfortable reminder of their constant presence. But it's not just the insects. It doesn't take long for you to notice the true masters of that underground, the rats. Agile creatures with bright eyes that move with a frightening familiarity. They know every corner of the cell, every forgotten piece of bread, every drop of water. And the most disturbing thing is that they do not fear the presence of humans. On the contrary, they know that everyone there is a captive, humans and rodents, equally vulnerable. It is a forced coexistence, where respect is imposed by instinct, not by choice. The sound of small footsteps echoes in the quietest hours. An incessant gnawing on wood or bone resonates as a reminder that even in the deepest isolation, you are never truly alone. There are watching eyes. There are presences sharing your space. You learn to tolerate, or at least to live with it. Fear gives way to pragmatism. There are battles that cannot be won, only endured. And in this underground world, you become just another element among many, a being in a forced ecosystem. And so, night after night, you come to accept that. Sometimes, the only company you can get comes from those who creep in the shadows. And then there are the chains, silent, uncompromising companions, always cold, even when the body no longer knows how to distinguish between day and night. They wrap around your wrists, around your ankles, maybe around your neck, depending on the severity of the punishment. They're not just there to prevent escape, they're an extension of the cell, a physical prolongation of confinement, a constant reminder that your will is no longer valid. The first contact is always a shock. The skin, sensitive and vulnerable, finds the cold touch of iron strange, and even after hours, days, the cold never seems to dissipate. The metal maintains an inhospitable temperature. On more humid nights, you almost believe that it breathes, that it feeds on the heat of your body. Over time, marks appear. First, a slight redness where the iron presses. Then, calluses, wounds that open and do not close easily. Every small movement is accompanied by a subtle scratch, a persistent burning. And the more you struggle, the more the chains become part of you. But it is in the mind that they cause the greatest damage. The perception that each gesture depends on a meticulous calculation, a pull of the arm that must respect the reach of the shackle, a lifting that only happens with the dragging of weight. The body forgets lightness. The movements become careful, rehearsed. The spirit also adapts. With each clang of the iron, a subtle message is sent. You are trapped, not just here, but here inside. Little by little, your thoughts begin to mold themselves to the rhythm of the chains. Freedom ceases to be an immediate concept. It becomes a distant, almost childish dream. There are prisoners who, after months or years of trying, their bodies bend to the shape that the iron allows. Their minds become silent, so as not to hear the cries of the past. And even when, by some rare chance, the chains are removed, a new captivity remains, the one that has taken hold within. And so, day after day, the cell shapes the body, the chains shape the soul, until you no longer know where the flesh ends, and the still begins. There is a moment that divides a prisoner's experience, before and after the punishment. It doesn't matter how many days or weeks you have endured in that cell. Everything changes. After, punishment comes with no warning. It comes like an unexpected shadow, a sudden creaking of the door, the sound of heavy footsteps, and the jingling of keys that never herald good news. You listen, still chained, as your body stiffens with fear. There is no genuine courage in these moments, only a primal instinct of self-preservation. The guards don't say much. Sometimes they don't say anything at all. Silence is part of the ritual. The sound of iron being unhooked, the chains tightening tighter, and then you are dragged away. The stone floor is unforgiving to bare feet. Every step is a struggle against growing dread. The corridor seems longer at times like this. Each flickering torch casts shadows that stretch across the damp walls. And as you move forward, other sounds join in. Muffled screams, moans that are lost in the echo, invisible tears that linger in the air like a perfume of pain. The location of the punishment varies. An isolated chamber, a wall marked by ancient suffering, or simply the stone floor itself, before indifferent eyes. There is no grandeur in the act, only raw brutality, and a coldness that comes not from the climate, but from the gaze of the one executing it. You no longer see the world as you used to. Every blow, every twist, every physical or mental humiliation tears not only your skin, but your memory. The body is a fragile record, but the mind, it records everything, and in the silence that follows, on your return to your cell, you carry invisible scars. Punishment never goes away, not when the wounds heal, not when the physical pain disappears. It becomes a constant whisper, an echo that resounds through the longest nights. And even when you think you have forgotten, all it takes is a sound, a shadow, for everything to come back, with the same strength as the first moment. So in the medieval cell, you learn that there are marks deeper than iron, and those are the ones you will never forget. As you rest, or try to rest, in the darkness of your cell, your mind may wander, and with it, images forged by modern stories. But not everything that is said about dungeons is true, and sometimes, what is real is even darker. Many imagine endless corridors of polished stone, with perfectly aligned iron doors, like in a fairy tale castle. But in reality, dungeons were improvised, adapted caves, forgotten cellars. Any space that could keep someone isolated was enough. Others speak of elaborate machines in every corner, complex torture devices, ready at any moment. In reality, such instruments existed, but they were reserved for specific occasions. The daily life of a medieval prisoner was much more permeated by neglect than by the spectacle of pain. And there are those who imagine perverse guards, always alert, always sadistic. The truth is that many prison guards were as apathetic as the prisoners themselves. Underpaid, tired, indifferent, their cruelty was born more from brutal routine than from deliberate pleasure. The chains themselves were not always heavy, thick and ornate as they are depicted in movies. Often, they were simple, crude, forged for the practical function of restraint. No adornment, no refinement, just cold steel, and an inescapable purpose. But perhaps the biggest myth was that of justice, that everyone there was guilty, that there was a fair trial, a logic behind the confinement. The reality was much more chaotic. All it took was one wrong look, one misplaced word, or the anger of someone powerful, and you would find yourself behind those walls. And so, as you contemplate these fragmented truths, a deeper understanding sets in. Dungeons were not temples of theatrical punishment. They were spaces of oblivion, places where time and people fell apart little by little. And that, perhaps, is even scarier than any story told around a campfire. Over time, you discover that there is something even more oppressive than the cold of the stones or the pain of the chains. It is silence, but not the natural silence of a forest, nor the stillness of a peaceful night. This is a silence built by emptiness. For the first few hours, it might go unnoticed, drowned out by the initial fear and the constant noise of your own mind. But as the days go by, it settles in. An invisible blanket covers everything. There are no voices. There are no frequent footsteps, just the occasional sound of dripping water, or your own breathing. And it is precisely in this sound void that imagination flourishes. Every drop of water seems like a premonition. Every tiny creek becomes a potential threat. Your mind, deprived of external stimuli, begins to manufacture its own echoes, its own monsters. Many say they could bear the cell, as long as there was someone to talk to. But there, conversation is a rare luxury. Prisoners are isolated, or silenced by exhaustion and distrust, and absolute silence, over time, takes on an almost physical quality. It weighs, it vibrates, it crushes. There comes a time when you realize that even screaming was preferable, because a scream is a sign that someone is still there, that life, no matter how painful it may be, still beats somewhere nearby. But when silence reigns, it brings with it the terrible doubt. Have I already been forgotten? You hear your own thoughts with disturbing clarity, and they repeat themselves. They circle back. Ideas that once seemed firm begin to dissolve. Reality wavers. In the dark and in the silence, the mind can become a labyrinth with no way out. So, ironically, many prisoners crave noise. Any noise. The rattle of a key, the distant jingle of chains, a muffled sob from another cell. Because sound here was a fragile thread connecting them to the outside world, to the world of the living. And when that thread broke, the real terror began. In a place where silence reigns, where time dissolves, and where every sound carries an omen, small gestures acquire an enormous weight. There, amidst the darkness and fear, a look, an almost imperceptible gesture, could mean more than 1,000 words. You learn this little by little. At first, you avoid looking at the other prisoners. Your instinct is to withdraw, to protect yourself. But prolonged isolation teaches you there are times when survival does not come from strength, but from connection. Picture the scene. A cellmate, perhaps a face you barely recognize. In the darkness, you notice a subtle movement, a slight raise of the eyebrows, a near smile. It's not politeness, it's a silent code. You are not alone. There are those who share a piece of stale bread, or a little water, not out of pure altruism, but because reciprocity is a valuable currency. Today you give, tomorrow you may need to receive. Every act of generosity is a fragile investment, but an essential one. Sometimes it is a simple, almost accidental touch on the shoulder that communicates silent solidarity. Other times, it is a barely audible murmur during the guard's round, a whisper that carries a warning, a piece of advice, or simply a comforting present. These gestures, invisible to those who live outside, become deep bonds. They save not only the body, but also the sanity, because knowing that, in a world of stone and iron, there is still someone who recognizes you as human, is a thin thread that keeps the mind intact. But, of course, everything must be done with extreme care. A misinterpreted gesture can cost dearly. That is why the look becomes language. Timing, a gift, and silence, an ally. Each small pact is sealed in the unsaid, in the almost invisible. And so you learn that, in an environment where almost everything has been taken from you, a simple look can be worth more than a whole life out there. Because there, in that abyss, is what remains of humanity. In the constant darkness, when the eyes reveal little, and sounds arrive laden with uncertainty, it is the sense of smell that begins to decipher the true story of the cell. And what a story it is. Dense, raw, impregnated in the very air you breathe. As soon as you wake up, before your muscles have even stretched, the smell greets you. Not a passing aroma, but a continuous, almost solid presence. A mixture of ancient humidity, mold embedded in the stones, sweat impregnated in forgotten fabrics. There is a metallic undertone too. The subtle smell of dried blood, of rust from chains, of tools left in a corner of the dungeon. Even if you don't see it, even if no one tells you, your no senses it. Here, old pains still whisper, but there are nuances. If you pay attention, and over time you learn to pay attention, you can tell when a cell has had recent visitors. A faint scent of fresh straw, perhaps brought in for a new prisoner, or a more acrid smell of decomposing bodies in neighboring cells. An ominous warning that not everyone leaves the cell walking. The guards say nothing. They don't need to. The smell speaks for them. When a prisoner is taken away and doesn't return, the cell soon notices his absence. The air seems stiller, heavier, as if carrying an invisible morning. This is how you learn who still resists and who has already been forgotten. There is also the scent of hope. Rare, ephemeral, but unmistakable. Perhaps when someone receives, in an extraordinary way, a visit, a letter, a piece of fruit, the brief aroma of something new, something that does not belong to that world, and that dissipates too quickly. Thus, amidst the deprivation of almost all of your senses, you begin to trust this unexpected companion. Your sense of smell becomes an invisible chronicler of your prison, a sincere narrator who does not lie, who does not disguise. Because in the stones, in the air, in the chains, everything has a smell, everything has a memory. And it is by breathing this, day after day, that you understand stories that no one would dare to tell out loud. Over time, when each day seems to merge into the next, you discover that the mind needs small refuges, not great hopes, because those become poisonous, but discreet rituals, intimate gestures that belong only to you and to the suspended time of the cell. And so, almost without realizing it, a ritual is born, perhaps inspired by an old habit, or in a moment of pure desperation. It doesn't have to be grand. On the contrary, its power lies precisely in its simplicity, an invisible thread that anchors the spirit when the body no longer has the strength. Imagine then, you wake up in that almost motionless darkness. Beside you, the chains rest heavily, but before any gesture, a moment, a small space for yourself. You gently touch a sliver of wood that you kept hidden. It has no apparent value, but in your touch lives a memory. With it in your hands, your thoughts flow. Maybe you silently recite a forgotten song from your childhood, or a part of a prayer that no longer has an owner. The words don't matter so much. What counts is the rhythm, the gentle beat that lulls a mind saturated with fear and repetition. Others created small mosaics with the breadcrumb, an ephemeral design that the slightest breeze would destroy. But while it lasts, it organizes the chaos. It traces shapes where there is only disorder. And deep down, it offers the prisoner a subtle certainty. I can still create. I can still choose. There are those who talk to the shadows projected on the walls. They give them names, stories, invisible companions for endless nights. And there are those who mark, with their fingernails, lines on a hidden stone, not to tell time, because time disappears there, but to say, I was here. I'm still here. These rituals, to an outsider, would seem like nonsense. But to those who live under iron and stone, they are invisible lifesavers. Each one keeps his secret. He protects his gesture like a silent amulet. And while performing the ritual, even if only for a few minutes, the prisoner becomes master of something, of an instant, of a choice. Thus, in cells where everything control and oppression, a simple personal ritual becomes a profound act of resistance, of preservation of the soul, and perhaps the only space of freedom that still remains. There is an instant, every time a torch is lit in the hallway, when the cell changes. The flickering light travels across the ancient stones, but it does not completely dispel the darkness. On the contrary, it creates a delicate play between light and darkness. And it is in this silent theater that the shadows come to life. You learn to wait for these moments, not because they bring safety, but because they offer an unexpected mirror. The torchlight projects your silhouette against the damp wall, a distorted outline, elongated, fragmented by the chains. And there, before that swaying figure, you see yourself as never before. It is not the image of the face you knew in the mirror. It is a reflection of what time and the cell have shaped. Hunched shoulders, tense limbs, eyes that seek a fixed point, but hesitate to find it. The shadows also reveal what you try to hide from yourself. Every involuntary tremor becomes amplified. Every quickened breath takes on visible form. You realize, with cruel clarity, how much you have changed, how much fear and fatigue have left deep marks. But there is more. Sometimes shadows become companions, the only constant interlocutor. It is common to see prisoners on the verge of sanity, dialoguing with these ephemeral figures, confiding in them thoughts that they would not dare share out loud, because, after all, who else would listen? Other times, shadows play with the mind, an illusion of movement, a figure where there should not be one, a face that forms for a fleeting moment, and disappears before reason can recapture it. It's these little scares that test the limits of the mind. But paradoxically, the shadows also offer a rare solace. They prove that you are still there, still have form, still project existence, in a place that devours time and identity. That in itself is a thin thread of humanity. And so, night after night, you learn to decipher the flickering contour, not as absolute truth, but as a reminder. The cell may have shaped your body, it may have corroded your mind, but as long as there is a shadow, you still resist. You no longer feel the weight of the chains as you did before. The body, over time, resigns itself. It learns to live with the cold iron, but the sound never becomes familiar. Every movement you make, or that of another prisoner, triggers a metallic clang that echoes through the cell like a wail. At first, it seems like background noise, but soon, you learn to hear it differently. It's not just a sound, it's a signal. There is a dark cadence to this tinkling, not a steady rhythm, but a series of echoes that mark the small rituals of life within. A prisoner struggling to his feet, a desperate gesture against the wall, the involuntary adjustment of a numb limb. And as the days or nights pass, if you can still distinguish one from the other, you notice a more disturbing pattern. There is a specific, distinct, clinking sound that announces what no one dares to name. A dry sound, followed by a hesitant shuffling, and then a prolonged silence. This is the sound that precedes the end, the invisible bell that marks a resistance that is exhausted. When someone's chains sound like this, erratic, heavily, everyone understands. There, a prisoner is giving in to exhaustion, to pain, to madness. The guards hear it too, and sometimes they respond. A creaking door, the echo of determined footsteps. And then new chains jingle as a body is taken away. Where? Few know, but the corridor becomes emptier, the cell quieter. This cycle repeats itself, insidious, and each time you hear that particular clink, a part of you cringes, not just out of fear of others, but because you know that one day, your own movement might sound like that. And when it does, it will be the harbinger of oblivion. Thus, even amidst the darkness and oppressive silence, it is the chains that tell the true story of the dungeon. A sound that, with each ring, reminds everyone that, in there, time is not measured in hours, but in lives that are extinguished. At first, you drank without thinking. Thirst was stronger than fear. But over time, with the stories whispered in the corners of the cells, each sip began to carry an unbearable weight. The water, brought in rough clay pots, was never reliable. It was cloudy, had an uncertain taste, and smelled somewhere between metallic and rancid. At first, you just hoped it wouldn't give you a fever or vomit. But soon, you realized the risk was more subtle and more sinister. Rumors ran through the chains, stories of tired or crawl guards who, to silence troublesome prisoners, resorted to discreet method. A little powder dissolved in water, a wine that was too salted, a substance that, little by little, weakened, sickened, and passed out. You didn't know what was true, but there was no room for trust there. Each vessel that appeared in the doorway brought a new dilemma: drink and satisfy an urgent need, or resist and prolong the thirst, knowing that this was also a sentence. Few were able to master this art of balance. Some simply licked their lips, waiting for more information. Others observed the behavior of the guards. An evasive look, an unusual haste, any sign that betrayed a hidden intention. But deep down, it was a game of luck. You might avoid a dangerous sip once, twice, but your body would give in. And when your throat burned, when your muscles begged for water, your mind would give in, and with it, the risk would return. Thus, drinking became a ritual of hesitation, an act fraught with anxiety. Because there, even the most natural and instinctive gesture could be turned into a trap, and with each sip, you learn the most bitter lesson. In the medieval cell, trust was a deadly luxury. As the days go by, or nights, because there is no difference between them, you realize that your most basic desires take on immense proportion, and among them, one stands out with unexpected strength: the desire to simply sleep. In the open air, it seems like a whim, almost naive, for someone who lives surrounded by stone and iron. But with time, the body and mind cry out for it. Not for complete freedom that seems unattainable, but for something smaller, more intimate, lying under an open sky, feeling the air move, hearing the distant song of an insect or the rustle of leaves. Inside here, the air is always the same, dense, humid, almost still. There is no breeze to cool the skin. There is no variation to soothe the senses. Each breath feels the same as the last, saturated with old smells, and the body, deprived of this vital flow, becomes heavy, lethargic. In the long night watches, you find yourself imagining not a vast field, nor a lush forest, just a small courtyard, a bare slab under the stars, maybe even a forgotten alley where the wind dared to pass, a place where the stone did not envelop you like a living coffin. But this desire is an unattainable luxury. The walls of the cell do not give way. The ceiling remains opaque, denying even the light of the moon, and every attempt to dream of the sky is interrupted by the clanking of chains or the biting cold of the stone beneath his body. Some prisoners try to recreate the sensation. They move to the cracks in the walls, where a thin stream of cooler air sometimes creeps in. They close their eyes, pretending that the pale breeze is a night wind. But it is a game of illusion that does not last long. So, you learn that their dreaming about the wind is, in itself, an act of resistance, and that sleeping outside, such a simple gesture for those who live outside, becomes a personal myth, a symbol of the most basic freedom, the one that one no longer dares to ask for. When the darkness of the cell becomes almost total, and the silence grows like a living entity, it is then that it manifests itself with greater force, hunger. Not an abrupt, desperate hunger, but a constant presence, which settles like a dull drum deep within the body. A growing emptiness that pulsates, and that transforms each minute into a weight that is difficult to bear. During the day, the mind is still distracted by the footsteps of the guards, the distant sounds, the small furtive interactions between prisoners. But when night falls, and the world outside falls asleep, only the body remains, and its inescapable need, the hard and scarce bread, eaten hours before, is no longer enough. The stomach protests silently, contracting, seeking answers that do not come, and with each contraction, a greater awareness of time arises. 1 minute, 2, 5, that drag on like invisible chains. The worst part is not the pain itself, it's the way it infiltrates your mind. Little by little, your thoughts stop wandering freely. They start to revolve around simple images. A steaming hot meal, a piece of juicy fruit, the aroma of freshly baked bread. You try to push them away, but they come back stronger, because hunger doesn't respect will. It doesn't give in to reason. It's primal, insistent, a brutal reminder of the body's fragility. And there, in the cell, it becomes almost an intimate enemy. Some prisoners try to fill their stomachs. They drink water in small sips, chew on fragments of wood, or hum old songs to distract their minds. But these are fragile palliative. As night falls, hunger wins. And so, minute after minute, you learn to live with this insidious presence. Hunger becomes part of the scenery, part of your very self. And as your body grows heavy, as your head throbs, you discover that there are pains that don't scream, but that, nevertheless, corrode everything. In the heart of the night, when the weight of hunger and fatigue has already dulled the senses, another sound breaks the silence with unexpected power. Not a bang, not a scream, but something much more subtle, and for that very reason, irresistible. Whispers. They appear like wisps of air, almost indistinct. At first, you're not sure if you've actually heard them. A faint whisper that seems to be lost before it can even be understood. But soon you realize, it's not your mind playing tricks. It's the living language of the runners. Prisoners have long learned that in such an environment, an open voice is a sentence. So they communicate with these slurred murmurs that slide across the stones, jumping from cell to cell. A nonverbal code, a fragile but vital chain of information. Sometimes whispers bring hope, a rumor that someone has been released, the arrival of a new prisoner with news of the outside world, or a subtle warning, tomorrow, be careful with the water. These words, filtered through fear, become gold to attentive ears. But what is heard is not always relief. Many whispers carry veiled sentences, the name of someone who will be taken, a dark premonition about the fate of a companion. And even when the details are vague, the tension grows, because knowing is a burden that not everyone wants to carry. You learn to listen carefully, to distinguish the tone, a whisper to drawn out. Maybe it's a rumor, an urgent whisper, something more serious. But even so, everything passes through filters of uncertainty, because in a medieval cell, the truth is as nebulous as the darkness on the walls, and there are nights when the whispers cease completely. An even deeper silence sets in, and you realize it is in these moments that the fear is greatest, because when no one dares to speak, it is a sign that the shadows are more attentive than ever. So, you start to wait for the whispers like a castaway waits for an echo in the vastness of the sea. Broken words, phantom voices, that, even without bringing guarantees, at least remind you that you are not alone in this abyss of stone and iron. In a world made of stone, iron and shadows, light becomes an extraordinary event, not a full, clear light, but a simple thread, a thin golden blade that, in rare moments, passes through a forgotten crack. You learn to wait for that moment, not because it comes often, but because when it does, it redefines everything. There is a specific corner of the cell where the stone is slightly worn, an almost invisible fissure, that opens onto a world you no longer see. At certain times that you only discover with time and vigilance, a ray of sunlight escapes through that crack. And there, in that uncertain line of light, you rediscover a last link with life outside. The warm touch on your skin, the golden glow that dances on your fingers. Everything acquires an almost sacred meaning. On days when the sky is overcast, the absence of this ray is like a new punishment. But when it appears, even for a few minutes, it is like a rebirth. Light does not just bring clarity, it brings memories of the wind in the leaves, of the warmth of a beloved face, of the time when freedom was a given. Some prisoners create small rituals around this moment. They align objects in the path of the light. They mark the passage of time with its appearance, or they simply close their eyes and let themselves be bathed in the heat, imagining that, on the other side of the wall, the world continues to vibrate. It is a light that does not illuminate the entire cell. It does not dispel shadows, but it redefines perspective, because it proves that, despite the iron and the stone, there is a sun that still rises, a sky that still exists, and that, somehow, you are still part of this cycle. When the lightning disappears, you feel a slight emptiness, but also a subtle renewal, a thread of hope that cannot be explained. But that is enough to get you through another day. And there, in the darkness that returns, you hold the certainty, tomorrow, perhaps, a new thread of light will find its way to you again. And when the night advances, when every last ray of light is extinguished and the whispers cease, only you are left, and your thoughts. It is at times like these that the cell seems to expand inward. The walls remain immobile, but the mind wanders unmoored, and what it finds is not always comfort. You find yourself reliving old images, a face you haven't seen in months or years, a stretch of road under the sun, the sound of a river at dusk, fragments of a life that now seem to belong to someone else. And with each memory, a thread of longing weaves itself into the present. But there are also questions, many, some simple, others that throb like wounds. Why am I here? Who forgot me? If today is my last day, will anyone know? And the more you think, the more time distorts. Minutes drag on like hours like eternities. There are bitter reflection, moments when you almost envy those who have left, because uncertainty corrodes, not knowing the destination, not knowing if tomorrow will be different, or just more of the same. And on this threshold between hope and resignation, the mind dances dangerously. But there are also flashes of resistance, thoughts that, even though fragile, shine like small embers. I'm still here. I still think. It's still me. And holding on to that spark of identity becomes an act of profound courage. You learn to talk to yourself, not out loud. The walls have heard too much, but in an internal flow, almost like a silent song. And in this intimate space, you rediscover small reasons to keep going. A cherished memory, a gesture to repeat, a dream to keep. Thus, night after night, the imaginary prisoner who could be any one of us writes, on the walls of our minds, an invisible diary. A silent testament that, even in the deepest confinement, the human spirit resists and reflects. There is a peculiar kind of tiredness that is only known behind stone walls. It is not physical tiredness, nor even emotional. It is a tiredness of the soul, a profound exhaustion that invades even dreams. When sleep finally arrives, it is fragile and restless, and does not bring relief. It brings echoes, distorted scenes, fragments of a past that mix with the oppressive present. And so, instead of refuge, the dream becomes a new prison. You dream that you walk through free streets, that the sky opens above, that dear voices call to you. But something is always wrong. Shadows follow your steps. The ground crumbles, and before you can escape, the chains return. And in that moment, you wake up. But waking up does not mean liberation. The cold of the stone under the skin, the clanking of the chain, the air saturated with humidity, everything confirms the real nightmare was not in the dream. It was, and still is, all around you. And there is a moment upon waking when the despair is almost unbearable, because for a brief moment, the dream offered an illusion of freedom, and returning to the cell is like falling again into a familiar abyss, but ever deeper. You learn, over time, to fear both sleep and wakefulness, because both are prisons, one without control, the other without solace. And in this continuous cycle, where waking is like starting a waking nightmare all over again, hope is fragmented, but still, you carry on. Because deep within the human mind, there is a tenuous, almost invisible force that refuses to give in completely. And it is this force that, with each awakening, even on the darkest of days, whispers, I'm still here. I'm still breathing. And so the cell remains, silent, cold, and full of echoes. But you, who have walked this journey with us, can now, little by little, release the weight of these walls. May this story dissolve gently into your thoughts, and may the rest of the night bring you true rest. asleep where the chains no longer reach. I'll be here, whispering new stories, whenever you need me. If this journey has found a quiet corner in your mind, well, there are many more waiting for you here. And whenever you want, just come back.